Hey, it's Matthew. So, today is a beautiful sunny day, and had to go for a drive this morning, so I figured I would just turn on the camera and see where we go from here. So I've been reflecting on the idea of God being all, and having the warfare that surrounds. I've been having the temptation to have these cold symptoms, the itchy, scratchy cough, throat, and the stuffy nose, and the interesting part is that I can get it to go away. I get into the allness of God, and then the symptoms disappear. And then it seems like there's another self that wants to come into the picture, and it demonstrates all these symptoms. It wants to just reemerge. And this has been going on for like 2 weeks now. I'll do a couple sets. I'll get my vibration high. I'll change my picture that I'm imagining on the screen of my thought. And then I'll be symptom free and I'll feel wonderful. And then this vapor, like Quimby used to say, it was a vapor. It's a cloud of thought comes over, and then it brings about this manifestation of terror, disease, error, sickness, all these things. And so this is the wrestling that goes on in the spirit. This is the persisting to outcompete your enemy. You really have to persist until, and you never give up. You never, ever give up. You have to demonstrate God's allness by holding steadfast to it. It took me 6 years to completely eradicate every vestige of what they were calling Lyme disease. And so that was a long, persistent effort. And it's not to say I didn't have wonderful experiences within that 6 years. It wasn't like it was just one long, painful struggle. It was not. It was breaking through to new levels of peace and joy, and then falling into, onion layers of fear that would come up, manifesting on the body. And that's what really happens, is that when truth gets in us, all these latent fears come up and they start to demonstrate themselves for one last rodeo, calling it like retracing. If you think about the standardized natural healing model, they say you retrace symptoms on the way out, and that sort of follows the law of going into disease and then coming out. How it's bound is how you have to unbind it. So we have to kind of say goodbye one more time and see that fear face to face in order to bring the correctness, the correct side of God or good, and then it disappears. And I feel like that's happening now, and it goes all the way back. This goes way back to probably my birth, when I was born without fully developed lungs, and that fear of coming into the world, not being embraced by my mother, having to be put on those tubes, those breathing apparatuses, whatever they were, and those mortal terrors, they get triggered. And and I remember years ago when I used to have to sorry, I have to keep the camera here, struggle with I'd go into this reliving of a experience like that through a PTSD, and I'd have to go into this trauma of I can't breathe, and it would go on for hours, and then when it would fade away, I would be symptom free all over again. And see, that's the irony of it, is that I'd be symptom free after the shock of whatever it was gone. But while I was symptomatic, everything would get inflamed, everything would be arduous, everything was restricted, and all the symptoms seemed very, very real. They were very, very disturbing. And that really is the dream of the material five senses, the life of mortality. It is a dream. And so I've been holding to a principle of spirit as allness of creation. And like the 91st Psalm, 91 verse 14, I'm putting my affection on God, knowing God's location, spirit, my identity rooted in that location as the reflection of that. And then the symptoms will quieten down. They just kind of go down to nothing. And then this wave comes over, and I get into the other mind, if you will. There is no other mind, but that other carnal mind of mortality seems to draw. It has a drawing power, and what draws it in is fear. It's terror. It's trauma. It's really trauma that draws us in. And so I really believe that I've tapped into something that's taken me to the deepest levels of healing in this new chapter of my life, which I'm going to write the book about, called Love, Living the Good Life. And with that said, it's drawing up to the surface all the deepest layers that have to come up and be released and set free. So it reminds me of the story of Phineas Parker's Quimby when he had consumption. So bad that he couldn't barely stand up or walk, and he was probably in the last stages of it, and he heard somebody cured it with horseback riding. So he went, and he was up on top of a hill, and he was off the horse, and something startled his horse, and it was going to take off, and he grabbed and held on for dear life and went down the hill, because he realized he couldn't be left up there on that hill by himself. He would never make it down on his own strength. He was really that weak. He would be just left there to die. Well, anyway, that shock and startled him, and it, according to him, it changed the fluids. He got to the bottom, and he realized that he was as strong as ever, and his breathing was perfect. So he was talking about the same phenomenon, that in a certain level of consciousness, he was free of all symptoms. And yet, at another level of consciousness, he had all of these horrendous, terrifying symptoms that mortal mind would call the disease. They would call those symptoms the disease, then they would give power to the disease and say the disease have a life of its own. So he would go on to discover that he could empathize with people, and he could take those symptoms on. Just like if someone yawns in a room, and then you also feel the sensation in your throat, and you yawn. That is the sympathy that he was talking about. He could go into a room with a patient that he was going to heal mentally with his mental curing abilities, and he would take on their symptoms, and then he would explain to them how they felt, and they'd say, well, yes, that's how I feel. And he'd say, well, that's right, and how can I feel this way, and yet I do not have the disease? And so what he was essentially doing by revealing that information to them is that if he could take those symptoms on, and there was no life or no power in a disease because it wasn't present within him, so how could he have the same phenomenon and yet have no disease? He was undoing the law of flesh by making the assertion that there is no power to a symptom. It doesn't mean that there is a process or a law to carry forth anything in existence, because it couldn't be within him like it was within someone right next to him. And if it had a law, then it would have to operate equally and wholeheartedly. It would have to operate within all of the same vessels that carry those symptoms. And so he knew that it was just mind a certain level of mind that he called the belief that man lives in. He called it the belief that man lives in. And it was something that was rooted in a trauma, he said. He said it was rooted in a former experience that they had not yet left. In other words, there was a part of their consciousness still hanging on to that experience. And so he would have to go into that experience with them through the taking on of those symptoms and walk them out by explaining to them the nothingness of disease as anything more than just a belief, a human opinion. He said it was a human opinion, and anything that wasn't good or eternally harmonious had nothing to do with the principle of life. Now, a crude example of that would be, we could go into a room and essentially someone yawns and then we yawn. Or you go into a room and someone vomits, and the sense of smell, the olfactory stench of that vomit causes you to feel the gastric upset, and then you vomit as well. Now, what is that? I've seen both of those things happen. I've been in a room where someone yawned and then everybody around the room took their turns yawning. And I've been in a room where someone threw up and then 3 other people just spontaneously threw up right with them. Does that mean that they all had the flu? No. But yet they demonstrated the same symptoms. They demonstrated the same exact sensations in their 5 senses. But the law of the disease that was being carried forth was something that was happening in mind according to a belief rooted in a past trauma. According to Quimby, that was the case. And so he said that healing in this way was the most laborious work that you could possibly do. He said he had never strained as much in his entire life under any conditions as he did when he would have to heal a patient of certain illnesses, because as he would take those symptoms on, it would be the equivalent of trying to catch yourself in the middle of that yawn after you're taking it on from someone else and trying to stop that process of that carrying forth amid its belief cycle. You see, it was transferred to you because he said minds mingle. So the minds would mingle, they're communicating unconsciously. And the belief in one mind that, this yawn is contagious is mingling with the other, it's essentially the carnal mind observing itself is what it is. So it's the carnal mind observing itself. And so Quimby would have to war against it in the onset of it. That was his method. Now, Mary Baker Eddy with Christian Science, she said that, at the first sign of a disease process, you need to mentally stand your rebuttal. You need to know your innocence. You need to hold firm in your spiritual allness. You need to, stop it. Or if it began, then it required a lot more of this mental capacity to war in the truth, really. And so Quimby would put himself into the position where he would take on the fullness of their disease process, but he would do something a little different. So instead of going into fear, he didn't have any fear regarding it because he knew it was nothing more than a belief or an opinion, and therefore it had no life. And since it had no life, the only capacity it had to carry forth was in the mind of the observer. So he would take on those symptoms, and then he would move himself out of that distress into the peace and harmony of feeling well again, and then he would mentally impress that state of feeling well upon the person in terms of like, hey, you yawned, you gave me a yawn, now I'm going to send something back to you. I'm going to mentally mingle with you, and I'm going to put my higher degree of consciousness onto your lower degree of consciousness, and I'm going to eradicate this belief that yawns are contagious, because that's what's causing this operation here. You see, that's the crude way of saying it, but that's how he would do it. Is he'd go into the symptoms, refuse to believe the law of operation that the mind was asserting, that there was a disease process. He knew that it was nothingness and that it was just ignorance of truth, demonstrating itself as fear on the body. And so then he would move himself into the peace and harmony, the allness of God, if you will, and then he would mentally project that state onto the other mind, or the so-called other person. And also he would explain away their fear that this disease had a life, because he'd say, look, I just took on all of your symptoms, I moved back into the allness of spirit, into the well-being and the health of being the reflection of the one mind of harmony, and because I did that, I just showed you the nothingness of your disease, and now I'm going to resonate those feelings back to you. And that's how he did it. That was his process. I've read his books many times, and this is not an easy thing to do. This takes focus. It takes persistence. And it takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage. But you have all of those things because being the offspring of divine mind, you have unlimited capacity to focus on truth, because there is only divine mind. And that divine mind only knows truth. So it's the unreality that you're removing your focus from. That's really the key. And you also have courage and power and strength, because those are all qualities of God. And so being the allness of God is a spiritual truth of your real identity. And so this is what I've been doing for the past couple weeks, is going into the spiritual truth of my real identity. Symptoms disappear. And then what happens is the Prince of the Air comes, and I'm conscious enough to observe what's happening. So the Prince of the Air has taken over the internet, the TV, all of the airwaves. There is a frequency, because of the ritualistic pagan sorcery that's going on right now with the whole thing that's been going on for a couple years, and they have the virus is in the computer, if you will. That's what I'm saying. And so when you watch the screens, when you are into that frequency, they are using the screens to literally like yawn to the audience. But it's not a yawn. They're sending something else. That's what you call Egyptian sorcery. That's what's happening. They're using sorcery. Now, we undo that in the same process that Quimby would undo it as well. Is that the sorcery brings about the symptoms through the carnal mind observing itself. We have to take a step back and get into the allness of God by recognizing that all life is God. And then we remove man from the equation. We remove, woman, child, health. We remove all qualities, circumstances, conditions, and people. We remove all of that from the screen of thought and just have the allness of spiritual harmony and divine love as the only reality of creation. It's like the space between the phenomenon. the observer behind the mind. Pure awareness itself is the allness of creation. Now that pure awareness, it's a spirit. You could think of it as like your imagination. Can a physical illness touch your imagination and hurt it? No, because the two never intersect or coincide. Physicality never touches spirituality. They are antipodes. They are completely diametrically opposed to each other. The carnal mind is physical, and spirit is eternal, immutable, pure awareness itself. And the substance of your imagination is the form that God created, that is the body of the living Christ, where the truth exists. There is no truth in anything material. But the prince of the air is looking for any trace of carnality within you, within your turning away from God through fear. So wherever you turn away from God through fear, you open the door for the enemy to get a foothold. And you do that by making judgments and qualifications of people, circumstances, conditions, and events, as giving them a label of good or bad. You see somebody that's sick, okay? And you say, well, that's a sick person, that's bad. Well, first of all, let's get into the pure awareness itself. There isn't pure awareness in a person. There's just pure awareness. Period. Now, a person doesn't have the power to demonstrate any qualities because pure awareness has all qualities. God has all qualities. So there is no law to carry forth any so-called operation of sickness on a person because God never created sickness and God never created a person capable of having sickness. There's no such creation. Now, when we remove all that stuff and we go back to just pure awareness itself, the empty blank screen of harmony that is undisrupted, unchanging, unfailing love, we can add the person back to the screen and we can say, okay, I cleared it's like an Etch-a-Sketch. The blank Etch-a-Sketch screen is the pure awareness of life itself. It's forever unchanging. That's the truth of reality. So we clear the Etch-a-Sketch, totally clear. We got rid of the people, conditions, circumstances, judgments of good and bad, right and wrong, sickness and health. All that stuff's gone. Pure awareness knows no other mind. It only exists and nothing else was created. Now we can draw on the Etch-a-Sketch. We can see the forms, add them back on, and know that the only qualities that they can contain are of the Etch-a-Sketch itself, the pure qualities of that pure awareness. There's nothing else that was created. And so by doing that, we can add onto it the truth. And we can recognize that everything in form is nothing but a vessel for God's goodness to come through. And if we wage that war, that is how we beat the prince of the air. Because the prince of the air is the serpent, and it is a nothingness from the beginning. Now, have I fought this battle before? I fight this battle all the time because minds do mingle. And I've done this so many times. And what I know to be true is that at every turn, there are two things that you need to know. The first thing is that when you deepen your level of truth and understanding, you also bring up any retracing. And now think of the Etch-a-Sketch when I say retracing. This is important. I quite literally mean that. You need to retrace the stuck memory that you suppressed, where that fear happened in your past, allegedly, because it's all happening now in the present. And you need to retrace that form by seeing only what God knows to be true about that form. And that will bring about the permanence in healing of that situation. Now go back about 2 minutes and listen to that about 10 times. until you actually understand what I'm saying. My life scripture, Romans 8, verse 10, and if Christ be in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the spirit is life because of righteousness, is what I just described about the Etch-a-Sketch and the drawing on there. So here's essentially what happens when you are so-called retracing an old traumatic experience. So in your former judgment, in your former wisdom, when you were not whole and complete. See, healing means to make whole. So some part of existence, allegedly, in your so-called past, contains a tainted memory where wholeness was not what was observed or judged by you. And so that judgment has come upon you. So what you do is you return to the blank Etch-a-Sketch screen, the allness of pure awareness. And that's what Psalm 91 verse 14 means. Read that psalm until you see it for yourself. So you get into the allness of spirit, recognizing that there can't be sickness and God. There's only God. There can't be poverty in God. That's preposterous. There's only God. There can't be a man separate from God, capable of experiencing anything God doesn't have. That's preposterous. And so you wipe away that off the Etch-a-Sketch screen. And you can just imagine wiping your mind like that with that old traumatic picture that comes to mind. Because that picture coming to mind is what is bringing the sensation of poverty, of illness, of ill harmony within relationships. It is the torment of a former judgment that's coming up to find its completeness in place of rest. That's a fact. So you remove all of the form and qualities and power that you have ascribed to anything within that picture off the screen. And you rest in the principle of unchanging, unfailing, divine love, life itself, knowing no other consciousness, no other power. There is no evil, there is no power against a good. There's only one principle of activity, one consciousness, one carrying forth of anything within this universe, and that is divine love's manifestation. So now, knowing that, add the picture of divine love's manifestation. Now you can reemerge the person back onto the Etch-a-Sketch, and you can bring about the qualities of God as the only demonstration that can happen, because that sketch on the screen, or the substance of mind, of spirit, can only contain the qualities of its creator, because there was nothing else ever created. So therein is the omission or the negation of the disease itself, which is the mental belief, the judgment that was amiss. To miss the mark is to sin, and that's what it was. And that's how we heal trauma. That's what's going on with me right now, is I'm purifying the mind. I am purifying thought, because truth comes in and it forces up anything unlike itself to come up and be purified. And this video gives you the secret of what's going on and how to purify yourself, not to mention why you should be very, very cautious around your screens, as the Prince of the Air has waged war against truth. But it also gives you the tools to be unaffected and unafraid of any of that warfare, because now you know this truth, and the truth alone is your shield and buckler. It's not your human will that saves you. Human will is a false god. The truth has already saved you, which means preserved your life. So understand these principles, and you will prosper.